Dear viewers, today we shall uh, take up the poem God Moves in a Mysterious Way by William Cowper. William Cowper is uh, a poet in the neoclassical period. He wrote this poem as a prayer song. So, what kind of a poet he is and what kind of a poem it is, we shall have the discussion on both these. Okay. So, in the last session, we had discussed another poem, Delight in Disorder, by Robert Herrick. And we discussed how that Robert Herrick went against the political system and puritanic discipline, and how he supported the King Charles I. So that itself is resulted in his poem Delight in Disorder. So today, with some objectives, we are going to discuss this poem. The objectives are, before we go to read the text of the poem, we have to know something about the poet in brief. That helps us to analyze the theme of the poem, and while analyzing the theme of the poem, we are supposed to analyze the images that are used by the poet in this poem, and we can also try our level best to interpret this poem in different possible ways. So these are the objectives. With these objectives, we should have this discussion on this poem, God Moves in a Mysterious Way. Let us know something about the poet. See, this poet, William Cowper, an English poet who lived in neoclassical period, and he had the romantic tendencies and romantic attitudes. Romantic tendencies and romantic attitudes means he believed in subjective approach to the concept, subjective approach to the concept of God, or any concept for that matter. And he had a romantic attitude, means he used to think independently with his own point of view. He never believed in any concept or any subject as all others believed. So that was his independency of the belief, or it was his independency of the way of thinking. And another important thing to be pointed out here, thing to be concentrated upon as far this poet is concerned, this poet suffered from loneliness and depression to such an extent that somewhere it is written that he made an attempt to commit suicide. To that extent, he suffered from loneliness and depression. To come out of that loneliness and depression, and to come out of that suicidal thoughts, he surrendered himself completely to the God. So in that submission to the God, he got some solace. He got some consolation to himself. He got some solace. So that is how he was very much influenced to write this poem, which happened to be the famous hymn, one of the famous hymns, and also it was sung in large number of churches for the decades together. And another thing is that his religious beliefs had their roots in evangelic Calvinism. Evangelic Calvinism means John Calvin was was an activist. He in a religious moment, who in the group of the Protestants, and he established his own theological belief, his own way of the faith in God or concept of God, and that is revealed here in this poem. So this much of the poet is enough, I think. Now let us move on to the poem. Let me first introduce the poem to you. That this poem first published in 1773 with the title Light Shining Out of Darkness. Later, that poem happened to be published in other editions, changing its title from the earlier title Light Shining Out of Darkness to God Moves in a Mysterious Way. So when it got that title, God Moves in a Mysterious Way, it became so famous hymn, it became so famous prayer song that was sung in large number of churches. So in this way, it came into the light, and it came to be a very popular song. And this popular prayer song, hymn, has the rhyming lines in praise of God, and that's why it became the prayer song. And this poem presents the image of God, or presents God in different forms, in different images. So that different forms of God are very elaborately shown in this poem from the beginning to the end. And here, as we go on reading this poem, we can see God as a creator, God as a savior, and God as a redeemer, as we have in Indian way of belief of God, that God is the creator and the protector and destroyer. So ಸೃಷ್ಟಿ ಲಯ ಮತ್ತು ಸ್ಥಿತಿ ಅನ್ನೋ ಕಾನ್ಸೆಪ್ಟನ್ನು ಇಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ನಾವು ಹಿಂಗೆ ದೇವ್ರನ್ನ ನಂಬ್ತೀವಲ್ಲ, ಆ ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಪೋಯಮಿನ ತುಂಬೆಲ್ಲ ದೇವರ ವಿವಿಧ ರೂಪಗಳನ್ನ ನಮಗೆ ಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಹೋಗ್ತಾನೆ. Then we can also see how the similarity between the Indian concept of God as omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. See, the Indian concept of God is similar to the concept of God that is presented by William Cowper in this poem. So let us have discussion on these issues after we go through the poem. Then we shall have these points of views which help us to interpret the poem or analyze this poem in detail. That God's omnipresence is discussed here. Footsteps in the sea, riding upon the storm, treasures in the deep mines. These show us that poet accepts that God is omnipresent. And then he accepts God's omnipotence because in the second stanza of the poem, he uses this phrase sovereign will, means he is omnipotent. He has all the power to do anything, that nothing will go against his order, his rule. So in this way, he is omnipotent. And at the same time, God is omniscient, because only he can understand himself, he can interpret himself to the living beings, but nobody can understand him. That's why he is the omniscient entity. And then, what are the other faces of God? God is fearful, and at the same time he is merciful. God is fearful, at the same time merciful, because God is one who brings thunder and lightning, and he results in rain. Okay, he brings thunder and lightning, and those will make us afraid. They will make us feel very horrible horror, but he brings rain out of them, and that's why he is fearful as well as merciful. And he is also sweet, sometimes bitter. He is bitter because to bring some sweetness to us, because without bitterness we cannot taste sweetness. Sweetness will not become very important and desirable if there is no bitterness. And he also tells the atheists that your atheism is a blind belief, he says, blind unbelief, he says. Means God is there, you should believe, but you should believe it rationally. That's why he says blind unbelief is a blunder. So atheism is a blunder according to him. And those who are atheists, they very often try to examine the God, and that's also a dangerous thing. You should not go examining the God. It would all be in vain. Okay. So with all these points of views, we have to understand this poem. Okay. Now let us go with the text and let us explain each and every line of the text. Then we will get large number of things out of this poem to be explained or to be analyzed into critical analysis or critical appreciation, or the possible number of interpretations. God, see, the text of the poem begins like this. God moves in a mysterious way, his wonders to perform. How is God? We cannot say how is God. God is mysterious. And because he is mysterious, he performs many wonders. We cannot see him how he is, and that's why we cannot imagine what he does. And he remains mysterious, at the same time he performs wonders. He plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. So what kind of God is, what kind of the power God is, what kind of the entity God is. God is very, very powerful, and he can do all the wonders. What kind of wonders he can perform? He performs the wonders of planting his steps on the sea. He can walk on the surface of water. Is it possible for any person? Is it possible for any man? No, it is impossible. But God can plant his footsteps on the sea. Means he can walk on the surface of the water, and he can ride upon the storm. He can ride upon the storm. Here you see, then where is God? God is in water. God is in the storm. So this is how we can understand this stanza. ದೇವರು ತುಂಬ ಅರ್ಥವಾಗದಂಥ ಒಂದು ಪರಿಕಲ್ಪನೆ. ದೇವರು ನೀವು ಅಂದ್ಕೊಂಡಷ್ಟು ಸುಲಭವಾಗಿ ನಮಗೆ ಕಾಣಿಸಿಕೊಳ್ಳುವಂತಹ ಒಂದು ಪರಿಕಲ್ಪನೆ ಅಲ್ಲ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿನೇ ಅವನೇನು ಮಾಡಿದರು, ತುಂಬ ವಂಡರ್ಸ್ಗಳನ್ನು, ಪವಾಡಗಳನ್ನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾನಂತೆ. ಎಂಥ ವಂಡರ್ಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ? ಅವನು ನೀರಿನ ಮೇಲೆ ನಡೆಯಬಲ್ಲ, ಸಮುದ್ರದ ಮೇಲ್ಮೈ ಮೇಲೆ, ನೀರಿನ ವಿಸ್ತಾರವಾದ ಸಮುದ್ರದ ಮೇಲ್ಮೈ ಮೇಲೆ ಅವನು ನಡೆಯಬಲ್ಲ, ಬಿರುಗಾಳಿಯ ಮೇಲೆ ಅವನು ಸವಾರಿ ಮಾಡಬಲ್ಲ, ಇಂಥ ವಂಡರ್ಸ್ಗಳನ್ನು ಪರ್ಫಾರ್ಮ್ ಮಾಡೋದ್ರಿಂದ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನವನು. ಅಂದರೆ ಇದರರ್ಥ ಅವನು ಎಂಥವನು ಅಂತ ನಿಮಗೆ ಸುಲಭವಾಗಿ ಕಾಣಿಸ್ಕೊಳಲ್ಲ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಅವನು ವೆರಿ ಮಿಸ್ಟೀರಿಯಸ್. ಹಿ ಮೂವ್ಸ್ ಇನ್ ಎ ಮಿಸ್ಟೀರಿಯಸ್ ವೇ. ನೌ ಮೂವ್ ಆನ್ ಟು ದ ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಸ್ಟಾಂಜಾ. Deep in unfathomable minds of never failing skill. See, this is also one of the wonders. In the deep unfathomable minds, if we dig this earth into its depth, we shall find the unvaluable, unmeasurable wealth. Unmeasurable wealth. It may be in the form of many minerals. It may be gold, it may be silver, it may be copper, it may be platinum, or it may be fuel. So it may be what else, all that is so unvaluable, unmeasurable, valuable. We cannot measure the value of that treasure we find in the mines. And how is it possible to have all this treasure in the mines? It is because He who is the creator has put all the treasure in the depth of this earth. So in the mines we can find all these treasures. He treasures up His bright designs and works His sovereign will. And He has His own plan. This God has kept His own plan, and whatever that happens in the world, it happens according to His plans. And nothing can go against His will, because His will is sovereign. It is supreme. Nobody can challenge it. Nobody can encounter it. Nobody can question it. Such a will is that God's will. That's why everything that happens in this world happens according to His rule, according to His will. That's why we very often say the law of nature rules every living being. Law of nature rules every living being. Whenever this living being goes against the law of nature, the nature will take revenge against him. The nature will take revenge against him. And that is why that law of nature is nothing but a sovereign will of God. Everything that happens according to the sovereign will. Even the shaking of a blade of grass is also ordered by the will of God, the sovereign will of God, and that's why that blade of grass shakes. ಈ ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಸ್ಟಾಂಜಾದಾಗ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ನೀವು ಈ ಭೂಮಿಯನ್ನು ಬಗಿತಾ ಹೋದರೆ ಆ ಗಣಿಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಅಳತೆಗೂ ಮೀರಿದಂಥ ಅದ್ಭುತವಾದ ಸಂಪತ್ತು ಲಭ್ಯವಾಗೈತೆ. ಅದು ಸಂಪತ್ತು ಯಾವ್ಯಾವ ರೂಪದಾಗ, ಬಂಗಾರ, ಬೆಳ್ಳಿ, ವಜ್ರ, ಪ್ಲಾಟಿನಮ್, ಇಂಥ ಎಲ್ಲ ಸಂಪತ್ತು ಅಥವಾ ಫ್ಯೂಯಲ್, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಸಂಪತ್ತು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಐತಿ. ಯಾರು ಅದನ್ನ ಹೋಗಿ ಅಷ್ಟು ಆಳದಲ್ಲಿ ಹುದುಗಿಸಿ ಇಟ್ಟಿರೋರು? ಯಾರೋ ಒಬ್ಬರು. ಅವರೇ ಆ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟರ್. ಆ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟರ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಯಾರು ಅಲ್ಲ, ಈ ದೇವರು. ಇವನಿಗೆ ಹಿಂಗ್ಯಾಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ತಾನೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಅವನಿಗೆ ತಂದೆ ಆದಂಥ ಕೆಲವು ಡಿಸೈನ್ಸ್ಗಳಿದ್ದಾವೆ, ತಂದೆ ಆದಂಥ ಸ್ಕೀಮ್ಗಳಿದ್ದಾವೆ, ತಂದೆ ಆದಂಥ ಪ್ಲ್ಯಾನ್ಸ್ಗಳಿದ್ದಾವೆ. ಆ ಪ್ಲ್ಯಾನ್ಸ್ಗಳ ಪ್ರಕಾರ ಎಲ್ಲದನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ಅವನು ಎಕ್ಸಿಕ್ಯೂಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದಾನೆ. ಹಾಗಾಗಿ ಆ ಪ್ಲ್ಯಾನ್ ಪ್ರಕಾರ ಇಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲದೂ ನಡಿಬೇಕವನ. ನಾವ್ಯಾರು ಕೂಡ ಈ ಹುಲ್ಲು ಮಾನವರಾದ ನಾವು ಯಾರೂ ಕೂಡ ಅಥವಾ ಯಾವುದೇ ಲಿವಿಂಗ್ ಬೀಯಿಂಗು ಈ ಪ್ರಕೃತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಆ ದೇವರ ಆಜ್ಞೆಯನ್ನು ಮೀರಿ ನಡೆಯಲಾಗದು. ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಅವನ ಆಜ್ಞೆ ಅಂತದಂತೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಸಾವರನ್ ವಿಲ್, ಅದನ್ನು ಸಾರ್ವಭೌಮವಾದ ಇಚ್ಛೆ ಅದು. ಅದನ್ನು ಯಾರು ಕೂಡ ಮೀರೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಯಾರು ಕೂಡ ಪ್ರಶ್ನೆ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ, ಯಾರು ಕೂಡ ಅದರ ವಿರುದ್ಧ ಸವಾಲನ್ನು ಎಸೆಯೋಕ್ಕಾಗಲ್ಲ. ಅದಕ್ಕೇ ನಾವು ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಲಾ ಆಫ್ ನೇಚರ್ ಅಂತ, ಪ್ರಕೃತಿ ನಿಯಮ ಅಂತ, ನಿಸರ್ಗದ ನಿಯಮ ಅಂತ ಅಂತೀವಲ್ಲ. ಆ ನಿಸರ್ಗದ ನಿಯಮ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಎಂಥ ಪವರ್ಫುಲ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಆ ನಿಸರ್ಗದ ನಿಯಮದ ಪ್ರಕಾರನೇ ಎಲ್ಲದೂ ಕೂಡ ನಡಿಬೇಕು. ಒಂದು ಮಳೆ ಆಗ್ತತಿ ಅಂದರೆ, ಒಂದು ಗಾಳಿ ಬೀಸ್ತತಿ ಅಂದರೆ, ಒಂದು ಬಿಸಿಲು ಬೀಳ್ತತಿ ಅಂದರೆ, ಒಂದು ಹುಲ್ಲು ಕಡ್ಡಿ ಅಳುಗಾಡ್ತತಿ ಅಂದರು, ಅದು ಈ ನಿಸರ್ಗದ ನಿಯಮದ ಪ್ರಕಾರನೇ ಅಲುಗಾಡ್ತೈತಿ. ಅದು ಈ ದೇವರ ಸಾವರಿನ್ ವಿಲ್ಗೆ ಅನುಗುಣವಾಗಿಯೇ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಸಂಭವಿಸುತ್ತೆ. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿಯೇ ಮನುಷ್ಯ ಯಾವಾಗ ಈ ಪ್ರಕೃತಿಯ ನಿಯಮದ ವಿರುದ್ಧ ಹೋಗ್ತಾನೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಆ ದೇವರ ಸಾವರಿನ್ ವಿಲ್ಲಿನ ವಿರುದ್ಧ ಹೋಗ್ತಾನೆ, ಅವಾಗೆಲ್ಲ ಈ ಮನುಷ್ಯನಿಗೆ ಅಥವಾ ಈ ಲಿವಿಂಗ್ ಬೀಯಿಂಗ್ಸ್ಗಳ ವರ್ಲ್ಡ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಪಾಠನ, ಒಂದು ಲೆಸನ್ನನ್ನು ಅಥವಾ ಒಂದು ಸೇಡ್ನ ಈ ಪ್ರಕೃತಿ ತೀರ್ಸ್ಕೊಂತಂತೆ. Now let us move on to the next stanza. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take, the clouds, ye so much dread, are big with mercy and shall break in blessings on your head. Ye fearful saints, fresh courage take. Here the poet gives a call to the saints, the monasters, those who are engaged in meditation, those who are engaged in performing puja or worship to the God. Even they will be afraid when they listen to the clash among the clouds that causes the thunder and lightning, which is very horrible. So he gives a call to the saints, you take up courage, because the clouds are so dreadful, but the God has mercy in him. As the result of that dreadful clouds coming together will create the sound of thunder and lightning, but immediately after that thunder and lightning, those clouds will pour down the rain over our heads. It is the mercy that is shown by the God, the Creator. ಇವನು ಈ ಸೇಂಟ್ಸ್ಗಳಿಗೆ ಅಥವಾ ನಮ್ಮ ಈ ಪೂಜಾರರೇನು ಅದಾರಲ್ಲ ಅವರೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಒಂದು ಕರೆ ಕೊಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಏನಂದರೆ ನಿಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಭಯ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು, ಧೈರ್ಯ ತಂದುಕೊಡ್ರಿ. ಫ್ರೆಶ್ ಕರೇಜ್ ಟೇಕ್, ಭಯ ಪಡಬೇಡ್ರಿ, ಭಯ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ಆದರೆ ಧೈರ್ಯ ತಂದುಕೊಡ್ರಿ. ಯಾಕೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾ, ಯಾವ ಈ ಸೃಷ್ಟಿಕರ್ತ ಈ ಮೋಡಗಳನ್ನು ತಾಕಲಾಡಿಸಿ ಗುಡುಗು ಸಿಡಿಲಿನಂಥ ಭಯಾನಕವಾದಂಥ ಒಂದು ಶಬ್ದವನ್ನು ನಮಗೆ ಎದೆ ನಡುಕುವಂಥ ಶಬ್ದವನ್ನು ತಂದೊಡ್ತಾನಲ್ಲ, ಅವ ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಭಯ ಆಕೈತಿ ನಿಜ. ಹಾಗಂತ ದೇವರು ಯಾವಾಗಲೂ ನಮ್ಮ ಮೇಲೆ ಸಿಟ್ಟನ್ನೇ ತೋರಿಸಲ್ಲ. ಅವನಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಮೇಲೆ ಮರ್ಸಿನೂ ಕೂಡ ಐತಿ, ನಮ್ಮ ಮೇಲೆ ಕರುಣೆನೂ ಕೂಡ ಐತಿ. ಅದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ನೋಡ್ರಿ, ಮೊದಲು ಈ ಕ್ಲೌಡ್ಸ್ಗಳನ್ನು ತಾಕಲಾಡಿಸಿ ಭಯಾನಕವಾದಂಥ ಗುಡುಗು ಸಿಡಿಲುಗಳನ್ನು ತರ್ತಾನೆ, ಗುಡುಗು ಮಿಂಚುಗಳನ್ನು ತರ್ತಾನೆ, ಸಿಡಿಲು ತರ್ತಾನೆ. ಎಂಥ ಭಯಾನಕ ಅಂದರೆ ಯಾವ ಸಿಡಿಲಿಂದ ಎಷ್ಟು ಜನ ಸತ್ತೋಗ್ತಾರೋ ಅನ್ನೋ ಭಯ ಹುಟ್ಟುವಂತಹ ಸಿಡಿಲನ್ನು ತರ್ತಾನೆ, ಗುಡುಗನ್ನು ತರ್ತಾನೆ. ಆದರೆ ತತ್ಕ್ಷಣ ಆ ಗುಡುಗು ಸಿಡಿಲಿನ ಹಿಂದೆನೇ ಮಳೆನ ಸುರಿಸ್ತಾನೆ. ಅದು ಮರ್ಸಿಯ ರೂಪದಲ್ಲಿ ದೇವರು ಮಳೆನ ಸುರಿಸ್ತಾನೆ ನಮ್ಮ ತಲೆಯ ಮೇಲೆ. ಹೆಂಗೆ? ಗ್ರೇಟ್ ಬ್ಲೆಸ್ಸಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಥರ, ನಮಗೆ ಅನುಗ್ರಹದ ಥರ, ನಮಗೆ ಕೃಪೆಯ ಥರ, ಗ್ರೇಟ್ ಬ್ಲೆಸ್ಸಿಂಗ್ಸ್ ಥರ ನಮ್ಮ ಮೇಲೆ ಮಳೆನ ಸುರಿಸ್ತಾನೆ. ಸೊ ಎಟ್ ದ ಸೇಮ್ ಟೈಮ್ ದ ಗಾಡ್ ಈಸ್ ಫಿಯರ್ಫುಲ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಮರ್ಸಿಫುಲ್. ಗಾಡ್ ಈಸ್ ಟೆರಿಬಲ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಮರ್ಸಿಫುಲ್. He is so terrible that we are afraid of him, but at the same time he is very merciful that he will protect us, he will look after us, and he is for our good, not for anything else. Then let us move on to the next stanza. Judge not the Lord by feeble sense, but trust him for his grace. Don't be silly. by going to test him. Don't be silly. You don't underestimate or don't try to judge who is God and how is God and what is God like that. It is feeble sense. But trust him for his grace. Be confident that there is God. Believe that there is God. And God is there for doing good for us. And you believe it. And trust him for his grace. He is always there to look after us, to show mercy to us, and to do good for us. For that you trust him, trust the God. Behind a frowning providence, he hides a smiling face. Sometimes he becomes angry. Yes, sometimes he becomes angry. And that anger is just a warning to you to be aware of that God's presence. That anger is just a warning to you to be aware of the God's presence. When he is angry, he hides his smiling face. When he is angry, he hides his smiling face because he has purposes to ripen the fruit as fast, ripen the fruits as fast as possible, because he wants to present them to be eaten by us. He wants to present them to be eaten by us. Till that time, he wants to hide his smiling face, and he becomes angry. But he certainly provides us the fruits to be tasted. Unfolding every hour. See, this time is the greatest force in the existence of the universe. This time is the greatest force in the existence of the universe. How is it, how this time is the greatest force? Time is the greatest force because it carries the whole universe over its shoulder with all the changes that happen at every second, even in every blade of grass. I think you could understand how time is the great force. See, everything happens because the time carries this world with all those happenings, with all those changes that happen at every bit of a second. And that is why that time is the greatest force. Just to imagine if that time stops at once, that everything remains still, lifeless. Everything in the nature, everything in this world remains lifeless, remains a log of wood without moving, without any movement. It all stops still. It all remains still. Only because the time is moving and moving stoplessly. It is moving and moving without any stoppage anywhere on the way of its destiny. That is why this world is existing. That's why we are all living. Once that time stops its movement, then the whole activities in the world, the whole activities in the universe will remain still, will remain lifeless. The bud may have a bitter taste, but sweet will be the flower. See, this is the nature of God. God is not always smiling at us. The God is not always angry against us. He is angry because he tries to warn us to wait for some time, to get something good, to get some gift from him. And that's why the example is given, the bud may have a bitter taste. Before we get a fruit in the tree, it will be first in the form of a bud, then it will become flower. See, when it was a bud, and that bud was a bitter, means it was not so beautiful to look at. But when it becomes a flower, that flower will get its own color and it attracts everybody. So beautiful it would be. And that is the symbol of God. That is the nature of God. Then the last stanza. Blind unbelief is sure to err. See, you should believe God, be theists, don't be atheists. If you say that you are atheists, it is completely a blind unbelief. Blind unbelief is sure to err. If you don't believe, if you say that you don't believe in God, blindly you are negating the existence of God. Blindly you are refusing to accept the existence of God. Don't blindly examine the God, that the God is not existing. It is a blunder that you are committing. God is there, God is present in everybody's life, and scan his work in vain. But don't try to test him or examine him, or don't try to find out the God as to know where he is, in what form he is. It is really a great mistake you are going to commit, and all that will be in vain. You will get no fruit out of that. Blind unbelief is sure to err, and scan his work in vain. Don't try to scan what he is and what is he doing. All that you don't try to examine and test and scan, and don't try to find him out in which form he is, in which place he is. Don't try to find him out, because it is all impossible. It is all impossible. Do you know why it is all impossible to find out the God or to see the God in a particular form? Because God is his own interpreter. Where is God, and in which form God is, and what is he doing, and what he has given us, it is not possible to understand, but it is only the God who can interpret himself. Nobody else can interpret who is God and what God is doing and how God is and where God is. Like that, nobody can interpret, but only God himself is the interpreter of God. And he will make it plain. In large number of the things, he will make it plain, but it is left to we people to understand in which form he is and what he gives us and how we live according to his rule. It is all left to you. It is very plain that you are, it is left to you people to understand how God performs everything for us and how God creates this whole world for us. So this is the text of the poem. So let us discuss this poem with other points of views in the next period. What wonders he performs and treasures preserved by the God, all these are discussed in this poem. And in the next session we shall have how we can analyze this poem with certain ideas or issues or certain points of views. Okay, thank you one and all.